Hey guys, I hope you're doing well. Time for me to fulfill my guarantee, my unwritten guarantee of a response video to any of the worst culprits for pushing gender identity extremism within 24 hours of them uploading some nonsense video. And in this case, we're talking about Philosophy Tube. And on the subject of nonsense, I do think it's worth just stressing again and again and again that Philosophy Tube is really bad at philosophy. I pointed this out before in, the video where they were talking about Descartes. I've mentioned before how there are other channels that have dealt with how Philosophy Tube is just absolutely rubbish at philosophy. And in this case, it's going to be one of the major focuses of this video, simply because Philosophy Tube, by Philosophy Tube's own admission, doesn't want to talk about gender identity explicitly in this video. Now, obviously, we can still glean some of the beliefs about gender identity that are being expressed here, and we can still respond to those. But mostly, this is an attempt to just focus on the philosophy of social constructs, but specifically relating to metaphysics. So that's going to be what this video is about, and I hope you will enjoy it.
So if ethics is, how do I be a good driver? And aesthetics is, how do I make my car look cool? Metaphysics is, what are cars? What are they made of? How do they work?
Okay, so this is sort of wrong when it comes to identifying what metaphysics is. Now, the first thing about what are cars, that is basically metaphysics, like that gets a pass. But then the second thing, what are cars made of? On the surface, that isn't metaphysics. That's just physics. It's just, you could even say it's mechanics. It comes down to the actual material makeup of cars. Now, what you could say to be more accurate is that metaphysics would deal with the relationship between what a car is made of and the fact that it is a car. But to just say that metaphysics is about what is a car made of, that's not really true. A car, what a car is made of is something that can be observed through kind of direct science. Like I say, the metaphysical point about when you know what a car is made of, you then have to get into why does that make it a car? That's the metaphysical point. And then the third thing, how do they work? That's not metaphysics almost at all. And I say almost all, okay, because on the surface, again, how do cars work is it's physics, it's chemistry, it's obviously in an applied sense, it is mechanics and things like that, and engineering. It's not metaphysics, how a car works. If I take my car to the mechanic, then that mechanic can completely, understand how the car works and get the car working without ever having to engage in any sort of metaphysical points. Now, you could say that if you're saying, how does a car work, and you're understanding that in an explicitly metaphysical sense. So you're saying, how does a car work in the metaphysical reality? Like, maybe you could make it work. Maybe you could say, well, it's like, how does it work in terms of how does it exist? How does it in what, in an ontological sense? But I don't really know, because, and the problem is, even still, that's not a very good definition, because if the only way that you can understand how does a car work as being a metaphysical point is to understand that it's being made specifically with reference to some kind of metaphysical understanding of the term that is contrary to how the term would ordinarily be understood, that's not a good definition. That would be like if I said metaethics is about, is murder bad? On the surface, that's not metaethics, that's just ethics. But you could maybe say, well, I'm making that statement in a metaethical sense. So I'm saying, is murder bad in a more, metaethical sense? But that would be a terrible way of explaining what metaethics is, because if you can only understand what I'm referring to by already having a preconception of what metaethics is to understand that I'm using the phrase in a metaethical sense, it's no longer a good definition. That's basically what Philosophy Tube is doing here. To say, what is a car made of and how does it work are metaphysical points as a way to explain what metaphysics is, can't allow for the possibility that we're supposed to be understanding these terms in their metaphysical sense, because if we don't know what metaphysics is, because we're just having it explained to us by Philosophy Tube, then we aren't going to be able to understand it in a metaphysical sense. In terms of what metaphysics actually is, because it's easy for me to kind of make fun of Philosophy Tube for not being able to explain it very effectively, but I suppose I should give a shot at explaining it myself. I would say, well, first of all, what I already said, metaphysics is about the relationship between what something is in a observable physical sense and the deeper sense of what that is in an ontological sense. What is it about the physical construction of a car that makes it a car? And the second thing would probably be, how do the material mechanisms of the universe pervade basically the material world in a deeper sense to how we might initially assume they would? And that's when you get to things like, for example, questions about determinism and free will and things like that. That's how I would describe what metaphysics is. Obviously, it's a quite complicated topic, so I don't think anyone can describe it like really easily, but saying that metaphysics is about how do cars work and what are they made of is just so far from actually touching on anything that could be even charitably taken as an accurate description of what metaphysics is that I really, don't know how to handle it.
If you were to take a class, you might look at things like causation, free will, space, and time. I once had a metaphysics lecture.
Again, the first part was all right. The second part, again, not very good, because space and time is what you would look at. Like, you would think logically that you would understand if you are presenting yourself as a philosophy teacher on YouTube, as an edutainment philosophy channel, that you would understand that one of the things you're going to want to make clear when talking about metaphysics is how metaphysics is different from physics, right? Like, that would be an obvious thing. Like, if you wanted to explain meta-ethics, the first thing you'd want to do is make clear that there is a difference between meta-ethics, the actual ontological reality of moral decisions, moral choices, things like that, versus ethics, what is a moral decision. You would want to make that very obvious. And likewise, for metaphysics, you'd think you'd want to make it very clear the difference between metaphysics and physics. And yet, one of the things we're told is in metaphysics, you talk about time and space. Oh, okay. Unlike regular physics. But no, yeah, like the free will point, yeah, that obviously does relate to metaphysics. So again, half marks in both cases.
Imagine another Earth called Earth 2. And on Earth 2, they have all the same ideas we do about sex and race and gender, all those same categories, but they also have an extra one called Schmite. Schmite is very simple. There's two kinds of people on Earth 2, bigs and minis. Bigs is any adult over 5 feet tall, and minis is anyone under. And let's say that whether you're a big or a mini really affects your life on Earth 2. Like, if you're a big, you can get a better job, you can get a nicer house, you're allowed to marry whoever you like. If you're a mini, life is hard. Suppose we were to meet the people of Earth 2, and we said, Schmite is just a social construct. Being a big or being a mini, those are clearly relational properties. They depend on how other people feel about you. They might say, no, it's not. It's not about feelings. It's objectively observable. Look,
Okay. Again, another mistake. Something being a social construct does not mean that it's necessarily relational and about how people feel about you. Within this, so an analogy or an example that Philosophy Tube gave earlier in the video, and I have had to skip a bit, mostly because, to be fair, like when Philosophy Tube isn't saying anything particularly controversial, not too many mistakes are being made. There are a few, but not really worth kind of addressing too much. The example given is, this car is my favorite car.
if this car was my favorite, we would say that it has the property being my favorite, which is not only relational, but depends on my feelings rather than my location.
That was an example given of something which depends on your feelings towards a given object. And yet we wouldn't say that favorite cars are a social construct. I think this point could be elaborated on to prove it further, but I think the fact that even Philosophy Tube's given example of a something which depends on your feelings towards it isn't a social construct shows that arguing this depends on how you feel about it, therefore it's a social construct, is ridiculous. And of course, there are examples of the reverse situation where there are social constructs which aren't about how we feel about those things. So, for example, and this is a point which I think will be touched on a bit later, you can identify the social construct of race in different individuals without any referent to how you or anybody else feels about the properties that make them a given race. So, yes, if you are a racist, then one way that you might identify a given race, let's say black people, is based on your negative feelings towards them and things like that. But if you're just a regular person, then you'll just say, well, that person has black skin, therefore that property is not related to how I feel about it, it's just something I'm observing. Now, this leads to the other problem, which is that Philosophy Tube is arguing that this identification of height is in some way based on how you feel about it. And in this situation, Philosophy Tube, despite having actually tried to earlier on make clear how properties relate to metaphysics, is now turning around and misunderstanding that concept. Social constructs are basically categories by which we can categorize different groups of properties, not the properties themselves. Philosophy Tube's argument is that our categorization of short and tall people into two distinct groups is arbitrary and again, is it based on our feelings about them? Well, that's not actually, again, this is the problem to see. I don't know what to do because even that's not true. It's not based on our feelings about being short or tall. It's just based on our identification of those two different categories. But fine, okay, let's just run with that. So that is arbitrary. It's based on our feelings, even though it isn't. But even so, that doesn't mean that the properties themselves are contingent on our feelings about those properties. So yeah, it's kind of hard to break down all the ways that Philosophy Tube is misunderstanding every single concept being introduced, including based on even the internal logic of how Philosophy Tube has previously introduced and described these different concepts. But all right, let's continue.
You can measure somebody's height. Nobody's denying that. But what we're driving at is, why do you care?
Okay, so I just want to clarify that I agree with, in this scenario, the tall and big, the tall and short categorizations are social constructs. I just want to make that clear. I'm not disagreeing with Philosophy Tube's conclusion. I'm just disagreeing with every single aspect of the reasoning and philosophy that gets us there, because it's all completely mangled and whatever. And even here, there's kind of like a mistake in that the existence of social constructs doesn't really relate to how much you care about them. It's possible to have social constructs which don't particularly matter. And again, this is the thing that we'll touch on in a bit.
On Earth 1, some of us can carry children, some of us can't, so we evolve different societal roles and we make that distinction. Carrying and birthing a child is not a f***ing social construct. And they might go, okay, yeah, but what about Mother's Day cards? I mean, are you seriously telling me that you evolved to buy each other those? Get out of town. There's definitely some aspects of being a mother that you've invented. I mean, there's nature, you've got your natural properties, yeah, but then you guys, you've added a whole bunch of stuff on top of that. You're doing augmented reality shit, like projecting extra properties onto the world. On Earth 0, we don't have any of that.
Okay, this is a bad point, and I wasn't sure when to pause it, so I'm just going to pause it now. Within this context, we're talking about our current Earth, where, for example, there is not a concept of being tall and being short, and Philosophy Tube made up some terms for this. Rather, okay, so there aren't the social categories of being tall and being short. I think there was like Schmeit and something else. I can't remember. It was like the bigs and the it doesn't matter. Anyway, the point is that in this world, we don't have those. And yet, those do affect people's lives quite a lot. People are invested in the height of themselves and of people around them in varying contexts. There are lots of aspects of our society where being tall has advantages. So the argument that Philosophy Tube is making here is self-contradictory. Philosophy Tube is saying that having lots of additional kind of traditions, I guess, in terms of how we deal with certain material realities, speaks to the fact those things are social constructs, even though there are many such things associated with things which are not social constructs, like height. So really all Philosophy Tube is pointing out is that yes, we do have traditions. The problem is the argument seems to be that if there are traditions attached to something, then it must be a social construct, and that's just not true at all. For example, the movement of the sun in the sky over the course of the year is not a social construct. And yet we attach many, many traditions to the movement of the sun in the sky. When we can, based on our observations, conclude that the Earth has gone on one orbit around the sun, we have a birthday party for somebody. That is a tradition. And yet we wouldn't say that our understanding of the Earth moving around the sun is a social construct. So very simply put, the logic that having traditions attached to something makes that thing a social construct just doesn't really work at all. Or the idea that placing some kind of social value as well around something makes it a social construct, that doesn't work at all, because there are plenty of examples of things which are not social constructs, but have a social value attached to them, like height. I just noticed another problem here, which is that the celebration of Mother's Day is not necessary for someone to be considered a mother, so it is therefore not part of the definition of being a mother. The argument is that being a mother is just an expression of the material biological reality of being or getting pregnant and then giving birth to a child. And Philosophy Tube is saying, but what about this other superfluous thing that people do when somebody becomes a mother, Mother's Day cards. And obviously you can point to many other examples of, again, things which are superfluous to the fact somebody is a mother, but relate to the fact they are a mother. But the point being, that's not what makes somebody a mother. And you can see a very good analogy to this in the idea of being a woman versus femininity. So while we can say that there is femininity, which is a bunch of kind of superfluous traditional ideas about what you would expect a woman to do, for example, wearing a dress, you wouldn't say that the act of wearing a dress makes somebody a woman. So you could justifiably point out that there is the social construct of femininity, but you couldn't therefore argue that the category of woman itself is a social construct. And likewise, you could argue that there is a kind of social construct of having respect for mothers in terms of this kind of virtuous notion of what it means to be a mother and how parents are expected to treat their mothers, and all of that is kind of ideas, expectations that we've made up. But none of that means that the actual physical act of a biological female getting pregnant and having a child therefore becomes a social construct. So sorry. A lot of the time when I watch these videos, I actually, when I'm going back and editing them, I'm like, I've noticed another mistake, should I respond to it? And in this case, I was thinking, should I? And I thought, actually, you know what? This point I think was a big enough mistake, and to be honest, it was a mistake on my part not catching out the first time I watched it. So yeah, there we go.
And then suddenly, in come the people from Earth -1. And they're like, whoa, hold on there. What's all this? The only reason that the people of Earth 2 bother to measure height, the only reason they have a concept of height, is because they care about schmite.
And how does that follow at all? If the natural properties exist in reality, which they do, like there's no argument that a tall person is taller than a short person, then the simple observation of that does not entail automatically being is not automatically a social construct. Apart from anything else, how does this logic follow? Because if you measure the height of anything else, say for example, you can look at height and geometry in abstractions. So you can, obviously we've all kind of had the maths test with the triangle and you've got to work out the hypotenuse or whatever. You can do all of that. You can do all of that measurement in an abstract. So how on earth does, the only argument I can see being made there then would be that it somehow becomes socially constructed when you're applying it to people? That doesn't really make any sense to me at all. And again, I wish I could try wrap my head around this logic that something which is not only observable in reality but also observable in abstraction. You can just completely, you know, all of the logic of height and stuff can exist even without any sort of human society at all. You could indeed, and this is obviously getting into some ontological, debatable ground, but there is an argument to be made that even if nothing existed at all, it would still be true that the square of a hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the square of the two adjacent sides. So I'm not sure, like, but then suddenly what if you get like 3 humans to arrange themselves in a right angled triangle? Suddenly, what, Pythagoras is a social construct? I genuinely think that Philosophy Tube needs to explain these things better.
The act of measuring someone's height isn't a neutral thing that happens before they get assigned big or mini. When you measure something, you're already assuming that there is something there worth measuring. So
this again is bizarre, because it's like, so you're measuring the thing, but what about things you just observe? Are you suggesting, for example, that if you notice somebody's skin color, then their skin color automatically becomes a social construct?
these supposedly objective natural properties of yours are also social constructs. It's not augmented reality, it's full VR, son. On Earth -1, we don't have any of that. We're all just vibing. Presumably, life on those other Earths would look a little bit different.
Well, I guess on Earth -1, things are a bbit difficult because apparently they can't do basic maths because it's a social construct. Yeah, I don't know. Okay.
If you were walking around Earth 2, you'd see signs with like bigs only and stuff, because social constructs shape our environment.
Okay, I need to talk about this. This is the thing that bothers me. It's the thing, I kept saying like, oh, we'll get onto that in a bit. It's here. Philosophy Tube is deciding to characterize this hypothetical new social construct as one that is intensely discriminatory. And I just think, like ultimately I can't say that's wrong. Like I can't say your hypothetical scenario is wrong. But I think it's interesting because that's not really how social constructs exist for most people nowadays. This idea that having a social construct inherently should be taken as suggesting discrimination is complete nonsense. Like the fact that we have a concept of race does not automatically mean that there needs to be racial discrimination. And to suggest that is kind of like harmful because, again, you're kind of suggesting that, in order to say like, oh, that person's black or that person's white, there has to be something discriminatory going on there. It's kind of interesting to me because one of the things that Philosophy Tube then goes on to argue is that people are wrong to get so distressed and worked up about the suggestion that things might be social constructs. And yet, within Philosophy Tube's own video, there is this assumption that if there is a social construct around height, then you would expect to see rife discrimination around height. So Philosophy Tube is actually engaging in the moralizing of social constructs that has already been identified as a potential problem. So there we go.
Suppose we took a whole city of people here on Earth 1 and we erased their memories so they didn't know about sex and race. Would they reinvent those categories when they saw their environment? Would they look at public toilets and go, oh, hey, there's 2 different spaces here. But in our homes, we've only got 1. What's up with that? Would they go, oh, hey, we've got darker skin and we all live on the bad side of town where the houses aren't as nice? Why? Our social constructs have shaped our environment, which in turn reinforce our social constructs.
I find this interesting because, social constructs exist to describe society. So this isn't so much like a take on social constructs as it is like arriving at the actual definition of what a social construct is. Yes, if you had if people existed in a society but they still didn't have the language to identify the certain aspects of that society, they would invent social constructs to describe aspects of that society. The exact same way that it's kind of like asking if you erase people's knowledge of like physics, would they invent all of the scientific constructs used in physics? And the answer is probably yeah, because those constructs are useful to describe the physical world in the exact same way that social constructs would be invented because they're useful to describe the social world. Again, I'm not disagreeing with Philosophy Tube here. Philosophy Tube is correct. But the point is that this is like not, like I say, it's not an observation about social constructs. This isn't like, have you ever thought about this thing about social constructs? No, that's just what social constructs are. Now, regarding the question of like, what would they think about sex-segregated bathrooms if they lost the concepts of male and female and were only left to observe the physical differences between males and females without having the language of male and female to describe it? Well, I was kind of thinking I could try and get into, would they, just based on kind of the material reality of the male and female bodies, arrive at the idea that there should be two separate toilets? But I thought that's kind of like missing the point, isn't it? Like, the point is, you can't talk about sex-segregated bathrooms if you're ignoring the context of the history of male sexual violence against females. You know? Like, and there we go, that's like my point. Like, you're basically saying, if they no longer had and again, it kind of gets to what I was already saying, which is that most constructs exist, all constructs exist to describe reality. So if you are saying, well, what if they didn't know anything about reality? Well, then, yeah, sure, in some sense, the construct would be sort of useless. Like if you had a group of people who had no concept of patriarchy, of sex-based, discrimination and things like that, then it's quite possible that the idea of really needing sex-segregated bathrooms wouldn't make much sense to them. Like it wouldn't be something that was really high up on their priorities. I think it's quite a common gender-critical feminist point of view to say that the ultimate goal would be to get to a point where the differences between males and females do become increasingly socially irrelevant. And, basically through achieving equality between men and women. And within that context, sure, it's possible that you could get to a point where everybody, even, gender critical and other radical feminists, would say, yeah, actually sex segregation is becoming increasingly unnecessary because there is a less evident kind of reality of male violence against females and things like that. So yeah, it's just kind of like I say, you could kind of focus on just the mechanical reasons why you might want a separate place for males and a separate place for females. But why would you do that when that's divorcing the kind of question away from the most important factor, which is the actual history, the shared collective understanding we have of the relevance of sex in our society?
If you ask 3 philosophers how social constructs work, you'll get 4 theories. So we're going to look at one by a philosopher called Oshta.
Okay, this is like the laziest kind of thing you could possibly do, because it's like, guess what? Social constructs are really complicated. So rather than trying to look into the theories of lots of different philosophers on this matter and synthesize them into something that will actually be useful to you, I'm just going to tell you the beliefs of this one particular, quite obscure philosopher, so you can understand that. This would be like, imagine if you did like an ethics course and somebody said, like, let me tell you, if you ask philosophers what's right and wrong, you're going to get like loads of answers. So I just went with like Machiavelli. I just found him and I was like, yeah, it seems fine. So let me tell you that this is my ethics course. This is my video on ethics, guys. Just Machiavelli, I don't know why I went to Machiavelli. I don't even know if he's written that much about ethics. I know he mostly did political philosophy. Oh well. I didn't want to say anyone too obviously, because I guess that's kind of the point. Like, I wanted to go for somebody as obscure as this random Icelandic person.
All the spectators go, oh my god, was that a strike? And then the
Oh my god, what a great ContraPoints impression.
umpire has to decide. Strike 1! So according to Oshta, being a strike is a social construct that serves some purpose in the game by keeping track of the ball's underlying properties. Similarly, on Earth...
I mean, it wouldn't be a social construct, just for the record, like, that's because it's not society as it's a baseball game, but I guess it's just saying it's analogous to a social construct.
What is it for a feature of you or me to matter socially in a context? The answer I give is, a feature is socially significant in a context in which people taken to have the feature get conferred onto them a social status.
Okay, so I'm going to respond to this in a second, but I just, like, genuinely, I can't get over how lazy this is. To just, like, make a video on social constructs and just, like, choose. And it seems like, because this was the quote from, like, this same book was quoted earlier, so it's like, it genuinely does feel a little bit like one book was like read on this subject, and it's just like, yeah, let's just do that book. Like, genuinely, yeah, it's just mental that you wouldn't just actually read around the topic, and then maybe you would be making fewer mistakes. Also, I have to say, like, this quote was like a lot of time, like, slowly just reading it for basically a complete tautology to be the end result. Like, what does it mean if something matters? It means that you get a social status because of it. And it's like, well, what's a social status? A social status is a social identification that's deemed to matter. Like, because the thing is, I can't possibly refute this, and I would argue this statement is unfalsifiable, because by definition, a social status is anything that matters socially. And if something matters socially, then it has to confer some sort of social status. So it's just a completely pointless, like, statement, but whatever.
That last bit is important. Baseball's one thing, people are another. Properties like being a woman, being a man, a mother, black, white, that's not a game. That's your life. Consider the property being cool in the context of a high school. Wearing the right clothes and having the right attitude, liking the right music. It's not really a set list, and you don't have to have all of them. Philosophers actually have a word for this vague bunch. It's called a homeostatic property cluster. It comes from biology. Think about a word like mammals. Mammals have a whole bunch of properties. We have warm blood, we produce milk, we give birth to live offspring, and if an animal has enough of those properties, we say, okay, that's a mammal.
Okay, like, one problem with this. The difference in terms of, like, like, how extreme this is between being cool versus being a mammal is very extreme, and something you can't just gloss over as if the two things are analogous. Because being cool, like, the number of ways you can be cool is incredibly varied. There's all sorts of ways you can be cool, and of course it depends dramatically on all sorts of different contextual factors. To the extent that I would argue it's not a construct. Like, being cool, let's just clarify this, being cool is not a construct. Like, a construct is something which exists to help describe reality. And being cool doesn't really help to describe any sort of meaningful reality, because it's so varied in terms of what it can actually be describing. So yeah, I would say it's wrong to characterize being cool as a construct. But even if we say, okay, it is a construct, if it is, it's so radically different from the construct of being a mammal. Now, this is kind of a thing with a lot of scientific constructs. This idea that there's several different things coming in from several different angles, which help you get an idea of what it is you're really talking about. And I mean, for example, you see it with, like, the scientific construct of being a planet. What are the rules there? Okay, the Earth's a planet, but then we say asteroids aren't, because they're very small and there's a lot of them. But then we say the gas giants are. This is, like, a pretty obvious point, I think, in terms of, like, what a construct means. And obviously, I mean, we saw it with, like, elements too. These are scientific constructs.
If you know that an animal has warm blood and it gives birth to live offspring, you can predict X, Y, and Z about it, because the properties tend to occur together. When European scientists first encountered the platypus, they were confused. Some people thought they were faking, others thought they belonged in a category all their own, until they realized they had so many of the other properties in the mammal cluster that if you want to win the science game, you've got to classify them as mammals. On Earth
Okay, so just to clarify, what's being explained here is the concept of instrumentalism, which, no, I brought that up in response to Thought Slime on materialism. But yeah, instrumentalism, the idea that what is right, in some sense in a scientific context, is what works, what it is that makes it easier to do science.
They know about warm-blooded animals, yeah, but mammal is a social construct that we use to keep track of certain underlying properties.
Mammal is not a social construct. Again, like, I know that Philosophy Tube started this whole thing off like being like, oh, you know, different people use social constructs in different ways. You know, if somebody can be found who uses social construct in this way, I shall eat my hat. Yeah, it's a bad take. Yeah, mammal's not a social construct. It is a scientific construct. And the point that I would make is that something is a social construct when it is used to explain society. When the thing it is identifying exists within society. So different races of people, that concept of people being different races, is a social construct because it's describing something that exists within reality. The problem is if you say something other than this, then you end up with a weird situation where you'd have to say that, for example, elements are a social construct, because the periodic table is a scientific construct. It's something that scientists invented to help categorize different atoms based on their properties so that we can look at it and help to explain things. In the same way that we categorize different groups of people together into different social constructs in order to explain society. But that's the point, it's to explain society. Mammals, it's not a social construct because we observe it in the natural world independent of human society. So race, social construct. It exists in society. That's the only thing it's describing. Mammals, not a social construct. It's not something that just exists within society. Now, I will say this leads to another quite key point, which is sex. Do you know what also doesn't exist within society and therefore isn't a social construct? Biological sex. We can observe when we look at two different animals, and let's say we look at lions, just to use an example from a recent video, and we see that one of the lions has certain very obvious physical attributes, the other lion has certain obvious physical attributes, and we say that one of these lions is female, one of these lions is male. That's not a social construct, because lions don't have a society. So I just wanted to make that point very clear that, one, being a mammal is not a social construct in the same, and again, if you're going to argue that being a mammal is a social construct, you have to argue that like planets are a social construct, the laws of thermodynamics are social constructs, which at that point you've just made social construct a completely useless term. And like you've kind of like, again, if your whole argument is that like we've made up these categorizations in society that affect us, well, that no longer really meaningfully applies if you're saying that everything under the sun is now a social construct. Anyway, and the other thing I just wanted to point out is that like there's a whole point being made here about like how you use scientific constructs based on their analytic utility. And indeed, that's also true for social constructs as well. The reason why it's useful to have the idea of race is not because, as Philosophy Tube implied earlier on with the whole like bigs only thing, because social constructs are always kind of should be understood in moralistic terms as speaking to some kind of discrimination within that society or inequality within that society, but because social constructs help us to describe the reality of that society. It's useful to have not just an idea of being black, but also a very clear idea of what being black is, so that we can talk about racial politics while not getting completely confused. In the exact same way that it's useful to have a very clear idea of what being a woman means and who is a woman, so that we can talk about women being discriminated against, so we can talk about feminism, so we can talk about women's rights because we know what these things mean. So Philosophy Tube is touching on the fact that it's very useful to have an analytic utility in these terms you're using. And I would ask the question, what is the analytic utility of saying if somebody says that they're a woman, then they're just automatically a woman? What is the analytic utility of that?
On Earth -1, they don't even have the underlying properties. They're all just like, bro, have you seen these platypuses? These things are adorable.
So again, species is not a social construct, it's a scientific construct, but obviously Philosophy Tube does not understand the difference. But species, obviously, it's completely arbitrary. So just to clarify, this is a key point, which I think, Philosophy Tube doesn't make clear. But then obviously Philosophy Tube shouldn't even really be touching on this because it's not social constructs. But, part of it is social constructs. All animals are just varying degrees of genetic difference from each other. So, I am genetically very close to my family, and I am even more genetically close to people of the same ethnicity as me. And if you say that ethnicity and race are different, which some people do, you could say, then there's the race. Then, obviously, outside of that, there is the human species. And then you say, okay, so what's the rule? What makes something no longer a human species? Well, and this is the general rule, if I could not produce a fertile offspring with a member of another species, with another organism, then that organism is a different species from me. That's at least what I learned in science class. I'm not like an expert on science or anything. But then we've got things outside of that. I mean, there's like the family and the phylum and the genus and all that sort of stuff. And it just goes out and out and out. But every single distinction drawn is arbitrary. From my family, from me to my family, to my ethnicity, to my race, to my species, to my, whatever else. They're all arbitrary lines drawn on what is actually just a continuous relation. And you could say, well, obviously, the relationship between you and your sister is fundamentally different than a relationship between you and a fungus. And to that, I would say, it's actually just a matter of degrees. There is no obvious reason, no kind of sent down from on high reason why we would draw the lines where we draw them. We could say, for example, that there's literally just you, and then there's everything else, because everything else is genetically different from you, and the degree to which it is genetically different from you doesn't matter. So I'm just bringing this up to say that identifying a platypus is already a construct. And I know it was a joke, and I'm being kind of mean pointing this out, because it was just like, oh, look at this platypus. But if you actually had a world, and this is why I just think like it's important when you're like bringing up hypothetical worlds to actually consider the full implications of what you're bringing up. And in this hypothetical world where people don't have any constructs at all, they wouldn't have any idea of the thing being a platypus. They just say, oh, there's something which is some degree of genetic difference from me. Like, it would not be, there would be no obvious sense. If you did not have any kind of construct, there would be no obvious sense in which the relationship between yourself and a platypus is fundamentally different from the relationship between you and the person who like lives next door to you. Because you just say, well, they're just varying degrees of genetic difference from me, but I don't have any constructs to categorize how different they are from me. Or indeed, you could go the opposite way around. You could say like, that you think that the difference between you and a platypus is not really any more significant from an analytic perspective than the difference between a platypus and another platypus. And honestly, constructs are interesting. Like, it's interesting to think about the fact that, we could have a hypothetical world where we we have no kind of intra-human constructs, maybe even no intra-hominid constructs, just to make it more fun. I'm just like, yeah, all hominids are just, that's it, that's our construct, there's nothing below that. And then maybe we just have like a whole load of different constructs to describe like the varying degrees of like platypus, and like how they can differ from each other genetically and things like that. You could do that because obviously, yeah, the decision to draw the lines where they're drawn is kind of arbitrary, and that's what makes it a construct. But yeah, that's fun, I think.
Or the scientific community conferred the property of mammal on the platypus. What if communities disagree? What if someone was like, actually, the only important thing for deciding whether an animal is a mammal is whether or not it lays eggs?
So I'm just going to answer this question directly. If two people disagree on how a construct should be defined, then again, what there should meaningfully be questioning is the analytic utility of that construct. So it's actually completely legitimate for somebody to argue that certain ways of categorizing the world cause discrimination. I mean, heck, we saw this with, for example, Pluto. Let's actually use an example, a very obvious example. There were some people who, first started saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't consider Pluto a planet. And what basically happened? Well, the question had to be asked, how useful is it to understand that Pluto is a planet? And a few questions were, hello, who's that? Who's that messaging me? So, for example, you could say, well, how much like the other 8 planets is Pluto? And you say, well, actually, Pluto is very different. It's made from ice, it's much smaller, it's got a different orbit. So suddenly you're like, okay, so if we're talking about planets, we have to say, oh, it's, these rules for this planet, these rules for this planet. Oh, and then this one other planet that's different. And that's kind of not really very useful. It doesn't really help to explain the world when you have to keep making exceptions for this Pluto, which is different. So that's a way where it's not analytically useful. Then you say, well, actually, we have lots of other similarly sized objects around where Pluto is. And what do you say from that? Well, you say, okay, well, if we're going to call Pluto a planet, then we should be consistent, because what's very analytically useful? It's being consistent. If your analysis is not consistent, then it's pretty much useless. So if we're going to have an analytically useful framework, we need to start saying that all of these other similar things are planets. But as more and more of those planets emerge, you then have to start saying, well, how analytically useful is this? If now we've got loads and loads of these things which now have to be categorized, and they're going to kind of overshadow the, our own Earth, Mars, Venus, like the other 8 planets, because now we're going to have like 195,000 planets in our solar system. Again, it's, you would say that doesn't seem like it would be a very useful way to understand the concept of being a planet. And eventually, the disagreement became agreement. The agreement became that actually, if we want to understand things in a way that is useful, if we want to understand things in a way that helps to explain the world around us, let's say that Pluto isn't a planet. And now everybody's happy about that, and nobody serious is really saying like, oh, well, actually, it makes sense to still say Pluto is a planet. So we could ask, in other cases, how useful is it to say that, to understand a concept a particular way? How useful is it to say that a woman is anybody who says they're a woman, kind of regardless of why they say they're a woman, just based on the fact they feel like they're a woman? How useful is that? How useful is it to say that a woman is somebody who is feminine, somebody who wears dresses, somebody who wears high heels, somebody who wears makeup? Is that useful? Is that like a useful way to understand being a woman? How useful is it to say that a woman is a biological female, and a biological female is somebody who fits into the female phenotype, and the female phenotype can be identified based on a, admittedly slightly complicated series of biological indicators, but biological indicators that are, fortunately, overwhelmingly, quite clearly divided into 2 distinct groups. And even in the cases where it's not very clear, and I would recommend watching my video on debunking the sex spectrum if you haven't seen it, so I'll link that here. The good news is when I'm over here, I can point anywhere. It doesn't really matter because it'll be over here anyway. We can still actually clearly delineate between males and females. How useful is that? These are the questions we need to ask. So I'll be interested to see what Philosophy Tube has to say. Because I think this question of what do you do when people disagree about constructs, I think it's a really interesting question. So I'd be interested to see what Philosophy Tube has to say.
Why not? Ashta says, there is literally no answer to that.
Okay. So one, it's really funny that we're still doing like this the one person that Philosophy Tube could be bothered to read. And by the way, like I know people are gonna be like, well, those references in the corner. Okay, do you have any idea how easy it is to just like include references without actually understanding them? It's so easy. Like I cannot tell you how many times I had like a paper, I hadn't given myself enough time to do it. So literally I would just load up like a bunch of papers that mention the concept, just like read to a random point and just find something that I could like slot in there to get the references up. I'm like, yeah, okay, I'll just mention that concept. Boom, reference. Didn't understand the work, couldn't really tell you anything about what the overall point of it was, but I was able to include the references. So yeah, this is why, like I've said before, like I genuinely have quite a bit of disdain for like YouTubers who just like put a massive block of references in their videos, because I find 9 times out of 10, references are just things that you learn to do in like university so you get a good mark. It doesn't actually entail having to understand the concept you're dealing with. And I really do not think that, Philosophy Tube could have like references appearing like every second. And I'd be like, okay, that doesn't really tell me anything about how well Philosophy Tube understands this concept. The fact that the only author that Philosophy Tube is repeatedly referring to is this one person tells me that Philosophy Tube has literally only bothered to read like one book. And I'm being generous because you know that a lot of these left tube YouTubers, they like to pay people to do the work for them, to do the research for them, to do the editing for them. Because the left wing socialist YouTubers, they have the platform which brings in the money. They have the means of making money through their platform. And they know that the workers don't have that platform. So if the workers want to be able to create wealth, they need the capital that the channel owners have. So the channel owners say, hey, if you come along and work for me, I'll give you some of the value that is generated through this channel I own. But in return, I will extract the value, the surplus value of your labor. I will never get tired of that irony. But yeah, I don't think that Philosophy Tube is actually... So yeah, I'm being generous in saying Philosophy Tube only read one book on this subject, because for all I know, it was just the case of somebody else reading it and giving the cliff notes, writing the script, whatever. Although I'm tempted to say that Philosophy Tube must have written the script at least a bit, because, there's a lot of the same mistakes that I would expect to see in all of Philosophy Tube's other content. Anyway, but let's talk about this, seeing as it's the only person being quoted, let's talk about this idea that there's literally no answer. I gave an answer, so, let me be a philosopher, coach. I'm ready for it. I can tell you how to solve the pretty easy problem to solve of what happens when people disagree about constructs. It's not difficult, but apparently this philosopher, was like, oh, I don't know, it sounds like it would be pretty difficult to me.
Which might not matter so much for being cool, but there could be some other social properties where it might really affect your life if some...
Well, first of all, like being cool does affect people's lives quite a lot. Like people get bullied and stuff, which sucks. So just thought I'd point that out. But again, I would also say like being cool is like such a nebulous concept that it shouldn't be like put alongside things like race, which are comparatively quite easily defined.
Somebody refused to confer them on you. We've been talking today about baseball and platypuses, but...
Actually, we should probably go back for that big reveal. Guess what? It's actually about gender identity.
For being cool, but there could be some other social properties where it might really affect your life if somebody refused to confer them on you.
Yeah, imagine if... But, okay, here's the thing. Like, first of all, apart from anything else, you've just said that there's no solution if people disagree on how constructs should be defined. So, like, why are you even here? Right, if you're like coming out there and being like, you know what, if somebody disagrees of how you understand a particular construct, there's nothing you can do about it. It's just a complete waste of time. There's no answer. There's no solution. There's no ontology. There's no logic. Nothing's real. Strawberry fields forever. Then, like, what are you doing? What's the point? I mean, I know you're just here to make money at this point. Like, the lack of interest you have for actually engaging with philosophy makes it very obvious, like, where your priorities lie. But, yeah, like, what are you doing? Because then there's my take, which is actually that if people disagree on constructs, there is still a very meaningful discussion that can be had about that. But that wouldn't advantage you because, you know, I mean, spoiler alert, I don't think that just saying if someone says they're a woman is a very analytically useful way of understanding the concept of being a woman at all. And I don't think you can argue that it is. You know, I had a debate with somebody about whether or not they could, whether or not they thought that their way of understanding the concept of woman had any sort of greater analytic utility in understanding it through biological sex, and they didn't have a response. So there we go.
When I wrote the script, I deliberately went a bit more abstract with it because sometimes when we talk about social constructs, people get really angry.
Okay, can I just point out two things? One, I can't help but feel like if we'd actually been kind of talking about sex and stuff this whole time, then it would have opened the door for way more mistakes to be made, and this video will be even longer and perhaps slightly less nitpicky. Two, I like the statement of like people get really angry about it, and it's like you've got one side who's mostly just like, hey, you know, we disagree with how you're understanding that concept, how you're understanding that construct. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about why do you think that it makes sense for you to say that you're a woman just based on the fact that you say you're a woman. And then you've got the other people going, you bigot, I hate you, you're trying to kill me. So like, I mean, it's clear who's getting angry about things, but whatever, okay.
Like, remember earlier on, I talked about social constructs being full VR rather than augmented reality? That was a reference to a philosopher called Judith Butler. They wrote a famous book in the 90s called Gender Trouble, in which they argued that sex is a social construct, as opposed to a biological natural property. It's a pretty fascinating book. It spawned a lot of interesting philosophy. Maybe we could talk about it in detail another time. But people get so angry about it.
Considering like how badly Philosophy Tube has failed to understand like metaphysics, I just can't imagine imagine just Philosophy Tube trying to bluff their way through linguistic performativity. It's just like, oh no, spare me, please. Oh dear.
Unfortunately, some of the people who get angry about social constructs aren't really making a philosophical argument so much as they are trying to rationalize a dislike of trans people.
Okay, this is not true, and I do want to like stress that point. Well, okay, it might be true for like a tiny number of people, but if you're talking about like people who are, let's just say, have a base aversion to some trans-identified people based on, well, you know, let's say ordinarily things like them being gender non-conforming, even though a trans person wouldn't say that they're gender non-conforming because their understanding of genders has no analytic utility. Let's say that's the case. Most of those people aren't going to be talking about like social constructs or anything like that. And then the people who are talking about social constructs, they're not only talking about social constructs, but they're talking about social constructs far more and with far more kind of intelligence and like understanding than Philosophy Tube is. So yeah, I mean, sure, there probably are like some people who, and this is like a kind of common thing, who have co-opted the academic language, but then like, how many of those people really would even care to do so? Like the people who just like, men in dresses, I don't think they care to express it as like an aversion to what like social constructs, the idea of something being a social construct. But I would also point out that, again, your objection here is to people like moralizing the concept of being a social construct, even though that's what you've done throughout this whole video, and you're doing it right now. Like, the whole point at the start of this video was like, why do people get so angry? Why do people get so worked up about the concept of social constructs? And I'm like, well, I don't. Because I can understand that a social construct is just a something that you know, like an academic tool to help to explain society. That's what a social construct is. So I'm not stressed out about it at all. But you're the one who's stressed out about it. You and all the other essentialists, all the other bigots, all the other, you know, kind of reactionaries who aren't interested in trying to actually like look at the world through a materialist lens. And, you know, want to believe in kind of nonsense, and like the idea of like man essences and woman essences, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, you're the ones who get worked up about social constructs. Because, you know, somebody says to me, you know, being a biological male is a social construct. I'd say, you know what, I disagree actually. I don't think that's a useful way to understand the concept of being biologically male. Let's talk about that. Somebody says like, hey, you know, your magical woman essence that you think is inside you and that's been truly expressed by you identifying as a woman is not real. You go, ah! How could you say that? It is real.
Especially in my country, the debate about who does and does not have the property, being a woman or being a man, isn't really about metaphysics. It's just a kind of proxy way of deciding whether people like me get healthcare and human rights, which...
You do get healthcare and human rights. And yeah, of course, like, I'm sorry, the people who are debating whether or not you're a woman, that's the only thing they're talking about. Like the actual reality of whether or not you're a woman. In fact, almost definitionally, any discussion about whether or not somebody's a woman is, I'm trying to think if it's necessarily a metaphysical claim. I don't think it necessarily is, but it's a claim that certainly would relate, ultimately to metaphysics. Like the thing is that, if there are actual people who do just have, like, say, a base aversion to some trans-identified people, that's not going to be based on, like, a meaningful consideration of what it is that makes somebody a woman or a man. The people who are most interested in that question, meaningfully, like, actually caring and being invested in what makes somebody a woman, what makes somebody a man, is going to be overwhelmingly feminists and, obviously Marxists who are invested in kind of upholding material reality because material reality matters, things like that.
It's a shame. I mean, I think this philosophy is kind of interesting on its own.
Do you? Apparently not enough to read, like, more than one book.
I wish we could talk about it without that. I said up top that social constructs are built into...
Okay, like, I'm sorry. Can we just talk about this? Like, the absolute cowardice of being like, man, I want to talk about this topic, but some people... But some people disagree with me. Oh well, guess I can't talk about it. Imagine if gender critical people were like that. We wouldn't have any content. Imagine an alternative reality where, like, you had just Magdalene Burns come out in every single video and be like, hey guys, I really care about how, women should be defined. I really care about women's rights and making sure that the identity of being a woman is protected and actually retains its utility for feminist activism. So it's a shame some people disagree with me, because I guess I can't talk about it then. It's just, again, like, it's just, come on, like, just try. Or just admit that you don't really want to. Like, that's it. Just admit that you don't want to engage with people who disagree with you because you can't, Like, I'm pretty sure at this point, like, the cult is strong enough that they could literally hear you say that and they wouldn't even, like, be fazed. They're just like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, at this point, you could just be like, you know what? Screw it. We don't have any arguments against gender critical people. We're just going to keep calling them bigots, just to make sure, their ideas not taken seriously. I feel like if you just came out and were just honest about it, people would be like, yeah, that's fine. At this point, I'm already convinced that they're bigots who don't deserve to be taken seriously, so whatever. So why even bother with the charade of, like, I really want to talk about it. I really want to, defend my ideas in a free and open debate, but I can't do that if people are disagreeing with me. I want the special kind of debate where nobody disagrees with me.
Depending on how you explain the problem, different solutions present themselves.
Which is why it's important to be able to have open and honest discussion about, like, constructs and how they should be understood, and why it's perfectly legitimate for people to say that they feel that understanding the self-identity essentialist position or gender identity extremist position, that it's just about, like, you're a woman if you say you're a woman, that's useless, and that therefore we need to understand being a woman in a different way. It's perfectly legitimate for them to do that. You've literally offered up a defense of the very people you're saying are, like, bigots who shouldn't be allowed to have an opinion.
Consider that the gay rights movement in my country leant hard on the idea of born this way. The idea that homosexuality is innate and therefore can't be right or wrong. We can imagine that on Earth 3, they made a different argument. More like, whether it's innate or not, it's not the government's business. Like a personal freedom line. I'm not saying either approach is better, I'm just saying we can imagine a world in which the meaning of gay is socially constructed differently. But if you say to a gay person, hey, homosexuality, that's just a social construct, we might be like, whoa, what are you saying?
Wait, okay, I'm sorry. So now what you're saying is that being gay is a social construct because different people will defend it in different ways. Is that your take? Because that's not the right take. That's wrong. The actual reason why you could say being gay is a social construct is because you could say that different people, like, let me make the argument for you. For goodness sake, I can't believe I have to do this. Let me make your argument for you. The reason why being gay is a social construct is because it's, every single individual has a unique sexuality. There are different people who will be attracted to different individuals based on different things. And it just so happens that typically people are attracted to other people based along sex lines. And that therefore we have decided that once somebody has an overwhelming attraction to biological males, again, I realize I say I'm doing your argument for you. I'm doing it better because I'm actually, focusing on material reality, which is biological sex. Once somebody has an attraction to biological males that is, overwhelming, we would then say that that person is gay. But in some sense, that's a social construct because, apart from anything else, we know, for example, that in ancient Egyptian society, it was common for people to have a wife. Well, this would be upper officials to have a wife with whom they would have children. But then it was perfectly acceptable for them to have public lovers who could be any sex, and there was no stigma against an Egyptian pharaoh, for example, having a wife who he, would reproduce with, but then also, because obviously it's kind of important if you're a pharaoh to actually carry on the family line, but then just to go banging some buddies on the weekend, and it was not considered, dodgy to do that. In Rome, we know, for example, that it was more about whether or not you're the submissive or the active person. That there would be people who'd be like, yeah, sure, pounding some man meat, that's fine as long as he's not pounding my man. And the man meat is the butt, by the way, which I realize is kind of weird because sometimes we say that meat means like someone's willy, but I liked the phrase pounding some man meat, and that to me sounded like a more kind of dominant thing to do, for like pounding that man meat. But no, that's the thing. Like a Roman person would say that it's against their sexuality to have sex in a submissive way, because they like to have sex in an active way, for example. And if you said, well, is it with a man or a woman? They would be like, oh, it doesn't really matter. Like it wouldn't matter to them. So that's why sexuality is a social construct. And of course you can see it even today. Like, for example, the fact that most, lots of men will say that they're straight, but prisons and also, some other kind of like areas show that male sexuality, especially, by the way, straight male sexual violence, will often extend to actually engaging in homosexual encounters. And that doesn't necessarily, we could say in that sense, it will be kind of, some people might say, well, in that case, if somebody does that, then they're automatically gay. Other people might say, well, no, actually, that's not the case. And the point being, you've now decided you're going to draw a distinction where you're going to say, okay, well, this person's gay, this person isn't gay. And that distinction is ultimately socially constructed. Is being gay any man who would conceivably be willing to have sex with another biological male? Or does it matter why they're doing it? For example, if I'm a guard at Abu Ghraib prison and I decide to engage in an act of sexual humiliation to one of the prisoners there, am I now gay? Or am I just, a human rights abusing war criminal? Who knows? That's the distinction there is kind of arbitrary. So the point is, being gay is a social construct. It's at some point we say, well, you know what? This group of people, their sexuality, it's useful for us to have this term, being gay, to describe their sexuality. And it is a useful term. It's very useful. If somebody tells me they're gay, they're telling me some useful information, especially if I understand that they're talking about with reference to biological sex. That makes it a little bit more useful, rather than just saying, well, if someone says they're a man, I'm game. But yeah, so that's useful. But yeah, just to clarify, Philosophy Tube's argument here was, well, some people defend being gay in a different sense to how other people defend being gay, and therefore it's a social construct. Which, by the way, not only is that like a bad piece of logic, but also like the fact that even Philosophy Tube is assuming that in Earth 3 they would have the exact same concept of what it means to be gay. Like, Philosophy Tube has drunk the social construct Kool-Aid too, which I guess isn't really a surprise, all things considered. But yeah, there we go.
I deliberately chose non-controversial examples today to help you get a grasp of the metaphysics without getting bogged.
Thank you. And I deliberately responded to Philosophy Tube's nonsense to help you get a grasp of the metaphysics. And I'm glad we ended on, well, okay, let's finish up the video just so we can, before we give our closing thoughts. Maybe the good philosophy is coming in the next 4 minutes.
We're not just doing philosophy for the hell of it. We are tinkering with the engine of the world here. So drive safe.
I don't wanna feel this good just 'cause you.
Right, I'm assuming there's not going to be an end credit scene. So I mentioned before that I'm currently going through the Transgender Studies Reader chapter by chapter. I'm actually kind of started writing the scripts for that and things like that. Because it was a Patreon goal of mine. It will be a while because I want to make sure I'm a little bit ahead of the curve. So I don't want to just like get one video done and then, or, one script done and then record that. I kind of want to make sure that I'm like, get the ball rolling a bit more substantially. So I'm not sure when those videos will be out, but, I'm working on them in the background, which is, and it's interesting. One of the things that I was going to say in the video is like that you would think maybe that, being the Transgender Studies Reader, being a collection of works written by some of the greatest minds in transgender studies, that it would therefore be a lot more kind of compelling, a lot more kind of intelligent, a lot more well-reasoned than what we would expect to find from these people on YouTube who are basically just, ideologues who are in it, grifting for the money. And I was actually going to start off the video, like my plan as I was kind of writing the script was to be like, hey, actually it's not much better. These people are, genuinely still making really terrible arguments, still making really terrible leaps in logic and things like that. But now having actually reminded myself just how bad these YouTube ideologues are, I have to say that I'm looking forward to getting back to, for the next couple of days, I'll be working on, reading again, working on the Transgender Studies Reader videos, getting back to something which is still really bad, still really poorly argued, but better than this. You're not going to see like such elementary mistakes like what you've got here. So yeah, I just want to say if that's something which you want to support, then please do give on Patreon, because again, this is something where it is happening in the background. I'm probably going to kind of spend like, well, I think I'm going to try and do like videos now, which I can basically get done in a day. And then so if I upload like 2 videos a day, it basically means I can spend like the other days of the week working on stuff in the background. But yeah, if you like the idea of kind of higher effort videos, but videos which will be dealing with slightly more kind of like, well, in theory, the best of the best, the Transgender Studies Reader is kind of like the gold standard for like, these are the arguments that the transgender theorists, the top transgender academics thought this is what we want to put out. This is what we want people to understand about transgender studies. If you think that would be a useful thing to do, then please do give on Patreon. I'd really appreciate that. If you like this video in general, then like and share, and also comment to let me know like any thoughts you had. And also, if you want to follow me on Twitter, there'll be links to all the kind of like everything down in the comments below that matter. And of course, if you want to see more, then subscribe and stick around for the end scene so that you can see some of the other links there. But right now, I'll just say thank you to my current patrons: Hannah, Kirsten, Stephen, Nancy, Rubble, Lizu, Jessica, Constant, Adriana, Harper, Alex, Leica, Jane, George, Katie, Ryan, Vishnuvius, That Feminist, Lily, Emily, Frederico, Evan, Philip, Anna, Sophie, Jamie, Lena, Julie, Dustin, Rashmi, Marion, BJ, Joshua, Marina, Sam, Sarah, Kathleen, Jelena, Alexandra, Emma, Owen, Sarah, Ibishka, Chris, Clara, Amy, Gifka, Corey, Grape, Rays, Janet, Vince, Colin, Radio, OMG, Sad, Barnaby, Windsprite, Emma, Doubting, Chris, Gail, My Dude, Esme, Rachel, Radek. You're all very appreciated.